Dad, I'm not ready. Please, just one more minute." Those were the last words Elena Hayes whispered into the silence of her father's small apartment, her hand resting on the worn cotton of his favorite flannel shirt. But she couldn't believe the scene unfolding before her barely 48 hours after Arthur Hayes's heart stopped beating, 48 hours after she had promised to carry his legacy of kindness forward. Her husband, Julian, wasn't mourning. He was standing in the center of their grand foyer, his arm locked around the waist of Celeste Vane, a woman who had checked her watch during Arthur's funeral and whispered about time when the casket was lowered. Elena stood there, 8 months pregnant with a child who would never know his grandfather's smile, clutching a plain manila envelope that Julian had dismissed as trash from the handyman. She watched through a blur of tears as the man she had supported through every failure handed her a divorce decree while the scent of her father's funeral lilies was still heavy in the air. But what shattered Elena's soul into fragments so sharp they drew blood wasn't just the betrayal. It wasn't even the way Celeste smirked at Elena's swollen belly as if it were a bad investment. It was the memory of her father's shaking hand pressing that envelope into hers just before the end, his voice a raspy anchor. "Elena, the world will try to tell you that you are small because you are kind. They will try to tell you that you are poor because you don't flaunt. Open this when the wolves come. Show them who you really are." What Julian didn't know as he toasted his freedom with expensive champagne was that the man he called a penniless janitor hadn't been working for a paycheck, he'd been building an empire. What Celeste didn't realize as she looked at the worthless daughter of a handyman was that the very roof over her head, the very floor beneath her designer heels, and the very air she breathed belonged to the woman she was trying to throw into the street. Arthur Hayes wasn't a failure. He was the silent ghost in the machine of global finance, a billionaire who lived in a rent-controlled room to ensure his daughter grew a heart of gold rather than a heart of stone. And now, the predatory influence her father had warned her about had finally shown its teeth. Julian thought he was discarding a burden. He had no idea he was evicting the owner of his entire world. Before we dive in, if no one has told you today that kindness is not weakness and silence is not smallness, then you're in the right place. This channel exists for people who believe that the quiet ones, the overlooked ones, the ones the world mislabels and dismisses, they always have a story worth telling. Subscribe if that speaks to you. Turn on notifications so you never miss one. Because stories like Elena's don't just entertain, they remind us of something we already know but sometimes forget. Now, let's begin. The morning they buried Arthur Hayes, the sky couldn't decide between rain and gray, and neither could the handful of people who had come to say goodbye. 7 chairs. For mourners. A spray of white lilies that Elena had paid for herself because no one else had thought to order flowers for a man who had spent his life making other people's worlds more beautiful without ever asking for credit. She sat in the front row with her hands folded over the hard curve of her stomach, 8 months of life pressing against her ribs, and she tried to memorize her father's face one last time before the lid closed on it forever. The casket was simple. Plain pale wood, no brass fixtures, no engraved flourishes. She had chosen it the way her father would have chosen it, without pretense, without performance. It cost what it cost, and it was enough, because Arthur Hayes had always believed that enough was more than sufficient for a man with a clean conscience. Her phone buzzed at 10:14, just as the young priest began to speak. She should have left it alone. She knew better. But the number was Julian's, and some habits die slower than love does, so she tilted the screen toward her lap and read his message in the thin gray light of the funeral home. In the Celeste MTG, going to run long. Give Arthur my best LOL. Also, did you see the casket? Christ. Couldn't they spring for something that doesn't look like a returns department special? Elena read it once. Then she read it again, the way you reread something when your brain refuses to fully process it the first time. The LOL sat there on the screen like a small, cheerful wound. Around her, Dolores, her father's neighbor, the woman who had returned borrowed tools and left casseroles at his door, was weeping quietly into a folded tissue. The 2 parish men who came to every funeral regardless of whose it was had bowed their heads. The priest was reading from Psalm 23 in a voice that suggested he had done this many times and would do it many more. Elena put the phone face down on her thigh. She thought about Julian at that exact moment, not grieving, not even pretending to grieve, but sitting across a glass table from Celeste Vane with his jacket draped over the back of a leather chair, probably laughing at something that wasn't funny, probably touching her hand in the way that people touch hands when they believe no one who matters is watching. A merger meeting. That was what he had called it when he'd kissed her cheek that morning with the particular efficiency of a man checking a box. A merger meeting, while his wife sat alone in a funeral home holding the weight of a grief he would never understand and a child he had not once pressed his hand to her stomach to feel. The casket was simple. Her father had lived simply. He had fixed things with his hands, doors that wouldn't hang right, pipes that wept in the night, windows that had forgotten how to keep out the cold. He had driven a truck with a cracked dashboard and eaten lunch from a thermos and called her every Sunday evening at 7 o'clock without fail, his voice warm and steady and certain as a foundation. Julian had called him a handyman like it was a diagnosis. Like it was something to be embarrassed about at dinner parties. What Julian did not know, what Celeste did not know, what none of them knew, was that Arthur Hayes had built more than he had ever fixed. That the cracked dashboard and the thermos and the rent-controlled apartment had been choices, not circumstances. That the plain manila envelope her father had pressed into her hands in his final hour was not the ramblings of a sentimental old man. It was a key. But that knowledge was still sealed and quiet inside her coat pocket, and for now there was only this, a small room, a simple casket, and a daughter sitting alone in the front row while the lilies breathed their heavy sweetness into the air, and her husband laughed somewhere across the city at a dead man's coffin. She did not text him back. The lilies were still on the hallway table when Julian said it. Elena had barely crossed the threshold of their home, her coat still damp from the cemetery, her shoes still carrying the particular heaviness of freshly turned earth, when she found him in the foyer. He was not alone. Celeste stood slightly behind him and to the right, in the precise position of someone who has already begun to think of a place as hers. She was wearing a cream blazer and holding a glass of sparkling water with the casual ease of a woman who had been waiting, and had enjoyed the waiting. Julian had his phone in one hand and a document in the other. "Good," he said, when he saw Elena. "Not your home. Not how was it?" "Just good," like she had shown up on time for a meeting she hadn't known was scheduled. He held out the document. She didn't take it immediately. She stood there in her black coat with the missing button and looked at her husband, really looked at him, the way you look at something when you're trying to understand how you misread it for so long, and she felt the baby shift inside her, a slow roll of movement, as if the child already knew to brace itself. 48 hours, Julian said, setting the papers on the hall table beside the lilies when she didn't reach for them. "That's more than fair, Elena. I'm being generous." "Generous," she repeated. The word felt strange in her mouth. "You can take your personal things. Clothes, whatever. The rest stays." He glanced around the foyer, the marble floors, the double staircase, the chandelier that had taken 3 men 4 hours to hang, with the satisfied expression of a man surveying something he intends to keep. "I built this. All of it. I need you to understand that before you start thinking about making this difficult." Celeste turned slightly toward the window, as if the conversation bored her. As if Elena bored her. "You built this," Elena said quietly. "I did. My company, my deals, my contacts." "You were," he paused, and something moved across his face that she had once mistaken for thoughtfulness but now recognized as calculation. "You were supportive. I appreciate that. But support isn't equity, Elena. You didn't build anything. You attended dinners and decorated rooms and wrote thank you notes." He straightened his cuff. "I think we both know what you actually brought to this marriage." "And what was that?" He looked at her then, directly, without the performance of regret, and said it the way people say things they have been thinking for a long time and have finally decided they no longer need to keep behind their teeth. "You were a janitor's daughter who married well. That's not a legacy. That's luck. And luck runs out." The foyer held the silence that followed. Even Celeste had gone still. Elena looked at the document on the table. Then at the lilies, white, already beginning to soften at the edges, still faintly fragrant with the smell of her father's funeral. She thought about Arthur in that rent-controlled apartment, eating from a thermos, calling her every Sunday at 7. She thought about the way Julian had shaken her father's hand at their wedding with 2 pumps and a smile that didn't reach his eyes, then turned to his friends and made a joke she wasn't supposed to hear. She thought about the envelope, still inside her coat pocket, pressed against her ribs. She picked up the document. She did not look at Celeste. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry, though the pressure behind her eyes was enormous and specific, the way grief gets when it has nowhere left to go. 48 hours, she said. That's all I need. She walked past both of them toward the stairs, one hand resting lightly on her stomach, her father's envelope against her heart. Behind her she heard the quiet clink of Celeste setting down her glass, and then the low murmur of Julian's voice, and then laughter, soft, private, certain. They had no idea what they had just started. She had been sitting at the bus stop for 11 minutes when the black sedan pulled up. It was the kind of car that didn't belong on that particular street, too quiet, too deliberate, the kind of vehicle that moved through the world like it had already made arrangements. Elena watched it slow against the curb with the detached curiosity of someone who had used up her capacity for surprise in the last 48 hours. She had one bag at her feet, a carry-on she'd had since college, packed with what she could gather before her hands started shaking too badly to be useful. Her coat was still missing its button. The manila envelope was folded carefully inside the inner pocket, against her chest, where she had kept it since the funeral. The window came down. The man behind it was somewhere in his 50s, silver at the temples, with the kind of face that had learned long ago how to stay steady when other faces were falling apart. He was wearing a dark suit that had not come off any rack, and he was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately name, not pity, not curiosity, but something closer to recognition. Like he had been expecting to find her exactly here, on exactly this bench, with exactly that bag. "Elena Hayes," he said. It was not a question. She looked at him. "I don't know you." "No," he said. "But I knew your father." He reached across the seat and pushed the door open from the inside. "My name is Marcus Thorne. I've been waiting to speak with you for some time. I'd like to do that somewhere warmer than a bus stop, if you'll allow it." She should have hesitated longer. She knew that. But there was something in the way he said your father, carefully, with weight, the way people say the names of things they consider important, that moved her feet before her caution could catch up. She got in. The car was warm and smelled of leather and something faintly woody, and it pulled smoothly away from the curb as if the city were simply making room for it. Marcus Thorne did not speak immediately. He let her settle, let the heat work on her cold hands, let a full minute pass before he turned slightly toward her with his hands folded in his lap. "How much did your father tell you about his work?" he asked. "He was a handyman," Elena said. "He fixed things. He had a truck and a toolbox and he charged people fairly and he never," her voice caught on something and she steadied it, "he never talked much about money." Marcus nodded slowly, as if this was exactly what he expected her to say. He wouldn't have. That was deliberate. He reached into the briefcase at his feet and withdrew a folder, thick and ordered, with her father's full name printed on the tab in clean black type. He held it for a moment before he passed it to her. "Your father didn't fix sinks, Elena," he said. "He built cities." She looked at him. The Vantage Tower on Meridian. The Harlow Bridge reconstruction. The entire Eastfield commercial district that went up between 2009 and 2014. He said each one the way you cite facts, plainly, without decoration, because they don't require it. 14 infrastructure projects across 3 continents. 42 shell companies, all clean, all legal, all pointing back to a single holding entity that your father established in 1987. He paused. He was worth, at the time of his death, just under $4 billion. The number sat in the warm air of the car like something physical. Elena looked down at the folder in her hands. At her father's name on the tab. She thought about the thermos. The cracked dashboard. The flannel shirt worn soft from years of washing. She thought about Julian's voice, a janitor's daughter who got lucky, and felt something shift inside her that had nothing to do with the baby. "He never told me," she said. "He told you everything," Marcus said gently. "He just waited until you were ready to hear it." He glanced at the envelope visible beneath the fold of her coat. "I think it's time you opened that." The building didn't announce itself. That was the first thing Elena noticed as Marcus guided the sedan off the main boulevard and into an underground entrance on a street she had driven past 100 times without looking twice. No logo on the exterior. No grand facade angled for photographs. Just clean stone and deliberate architecture, the kind of building that had nothing to prove to people passing by. Her father's building, she was still learning to think. Her father's world. The elevator required Marcus's keycard and her thumbprint, a detail that made her breath catch, the understanding that her access had been arranged before she even knew there was anything to access. They rose 12 floors in silence. When the doors opened, it was into a space that stopped her moving entirely. Hayes Global occupied the entire floor. Floor-to-ceiling glass on 3 sides, the city laid out below like a blueprint. Clean lines, dark wood, the quiet industry of people who worked with the focused calm of those who understood exactly what they were protecting. Several of them looked up when Elena stepped out. One woman near the back stood immediately, and Elena recognized in her expression the same thing she had seen in Marcus's, not surprise, but a long-held readiness finally released. They knew, Elena said softly. Some of them have worked for your father for 20 years, Marcus said. They've been waiting for you. He led her into a corner office that still smelled, faintly and impossibly, of her father. The same soap. The same worn wood underneath it. On the desk sat a single framed photograph she recognized, the two of them at her college graduation, Arthur in a suit he had pressed himself, squinting into the sun and beaming like a man who had just watched the most important project of his life reach completion. She sat down. Marcus opened the folder on the desk between them and turned to a section marked with a red tab. The document beneath it was dense with legal language, but he walked her through it with the patience of someone who had rehearsed this moment. Arthur Hayes, in establishing the primary trust structure of Hayes Global, had anticipated one specific vulnerability. Not a market vulnerability. Not a regulatory one. A human one. He had watched his daughter love generously and trust completely, and he had loved her for it, and he had also quietly, methodically built a wall around everything she would one day inherit against the possibility that someone might try to reach her through it. Clause 14b. The predatory influence protection. Marcus read the key language aloud, his voice even and precise. Any individual found to have entered into or maintained a relationship with a primary Hayes beneficiary for the purpose of financial exploitation, asset acquisition, or inheritance manipulation would be immediately and irrevocably disqualified from any claim to Hayes holdings, including, and this was the language her father had apparently insisted upon, any asset, property, or financial instrument in which Hayes Global holds a direct or indirect interest. Elena looked up from the page. Julian's company, she said slowly. The Harlow redevelopment deal he closed last year. He was so proud of that deal. Hayes Global provided 40% of the underlying financing through a subsidiary, Marcus said. He doesn't know that. He has never known that. He let her sit with that for a moment before he continued. The mansion is mortgaged against a lending institution in which your father held a controlling interest. The office building where Julian's company is headquartered, Hayes acquired the property in 2019. 3 of his largest clients came to him through referrals that originated, indirectly, with your father's network. The city glittered below the glass. He built the floor Julian has been standing on, Elena said. And the walls, Marcus said. And the ceiling. She looked at the photograph on the desk. At her father's face, that open, unhurried smile, the one that had always made her feel like the world was more manageable than it appeared. She understood now that the smile had never been simple. It had been patient. It had been the expression of a man playing a very long game for the only reason that ever justified one. Love. What happens next? She asked. Marcus closed the folder. That, he said, is entirely up to you. The documents were spread across the conference table in Marcus's office like a map of something ugly. Elena had been there for 2 hours, her coat draped over the back of the chair, a cup of tea gone cold at her elbow. The baby had been restless all morning, pressing against her ribs with the persistent urgency of someone knocking on a door, and she kept one hand flat against her stomach as she read, as if she could reassure them both simultaneously. Marcus stood at the head of the table with his sleeves rolled to the elbows, the first concession to informality she had seen from him, and walked her through it page by page with the patience of a man who understood that some revelations needed to be arrived at slowly to be fully absorbed. It had started, he explained, 18 months ago. A series of transfers, modest at first, the kind of numbers that hid comfortably inside operating budgets and quarterly reports without triggering anything automatic. Julian's company, Arcturus Capital, had a subsidiary relationship with a mid-sized development firm called Freestone Holdings. Freestone Holdings, it turned out, was not as independent as its letterhead suggested. Its seed funding, its foundational infrastructure contracts, its first 3 years of operating capital, all of it traced back, through a chain of holding entities that grew more elaborate the deeper you followed it, to a single source. Hayes Global. Her father's company. The empire built in silence, brick by brick, while Arthur ate lunch from a thermos and charged people fairly for fixing their pipes. Julian didn't know, Marcus said, setting a finger on a particular page. When he first took the Freestone contract, he had no idea who ultimately owned it. Your father made certain of that. He structured Hayes Global specifically so that its presence was invisible to anyone who wasn't meant to see it. He paused. But that's not the interesting part. Elena looked up. The interesting part, Marcus continued, sliding another document toward her, is what Julian did once Freestone became profitable. Once the money started moving reliably. He let her look at the numbers herself, let her follow the columns with her own eyes, because he was the kind of man who understood that some things needed to be seen firsthand to be believed. The transfers were meticulous. Small enough to avoid automated flags, large enough to matter, rerouted through a personal account Julian had opened under a variant of his middle name, then moved again into a private account she recognized only because she had once seen the bank's logo on a statement he'd closed his laptop too quickly to hide. Over 18 months, the total came to a number that stopped her breath for a moment when she reached it. $3.7 million. She knew where it had gone. She had seen it without knowing what she was seeing. The Amalfi trip Celeste had photographed extensively for reasons Elena had told herself not to think about. The watch Julian had said was a client gift to himself for a good quarter. The apartment on the east side that had appeared in Celeste's social media as her little renovation project, tagged with the name of a designer whose day rate Elena now understood with nauseating clarity. He embezzled from a Hayes Global subsidiary, she said slowly. To pay for her. Yes. He stole from my father's company. She said it again because the first time hadn't fully landed. He called my father a penniless janitor and spent 3 years stealing from him. Marcus said nothing. He didn't need to. Elena sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, at the clean white expanse of it, while something moved through her that was not quite anger and not quite grief but carried the specific gravity of both. She thought about Julian at the foyer, document in hand, luck runs out. She thought about Celeste's cream blazer and her sparkling water and her small, patient smile. She brought her eyes back down to the table. Can we prove all of this? She asked. Marcus allowed himself the smallest suggestion of a smile. Elena, he said, your father kept records of everything. The invitations had been printed on heavy cream cardstock with gold foil lettering, because Celeste believed that the weight of an invitation communicated the importance of the people sending it. She had chosen the font herself. She had chosen everything herself, the floral arrangements, the caterer, the particular shade of blush for the table linens that she had described to the decorator as money, but softly. The party was called a brunch in the way that some things are called by smaller names to disguise their true ambition. It was not a brunch. It was a coronation. 43 guests filled the east terrace of the Montgomery estate, which Julian had been calling our home for the past 2 weeks with the ease of a man who had always planned to end up here. The morning was unseasonably bright, and the champagne was cold, and Celeste moved through the crowd in a white dress that had cost more than most people's monthly salaries, her hand finding Julian's arm at regular intervals as if to remind herself and everyone watching that the arm was now hers. Julian was in excellent spirits. He had been in excellent spirits for days, the particular buoyancy of a man who believes he has made all the right moves and is now simply waiting for the rewards to finish arriving. He laughed loudly at things that were mildly amusing. He refilled glasses he hadn't been asked to refill. He stood at the head of the terrace table with the posture of someone who had spent years imagining exactly this view and was finally standing inside it. To new beginnings, he said, raising his glass to the assembled guests sometime around 11:30, when the mimosas had done their work and the mood had loosened into something golden and uncritical. And to the courage it takes to build the life you actually deserve. There was applause. There were appreciative murmurs. Celeste tilted her face up toward him with a smile that had been practiced without ever quite losing the appearance of spontaneity. From somewhere near the garden end of the terrace, a woman named Patricia, a friend of Celeste's from before, the kind of friend who existed mainly to witness things, leaned toward her husband and said, just loud enough for the small cluster around her to hear, "Can you imagine? He was actually married to the help. The literal help. Her father fixed toilets." Soft laughter moved through the cluster like a current. "She showed up to sign the papers in a coat with a missing button," someone else offered. "Julian said she took one bag." One. More laughter. The champagne caught the light. Julian heard it and did not correct it. He simply smiled into his glass with the satisfaction of a man who considered this a fair summary of events. Celeste heard it and touched her diamond engagement ring with her thumb, an unconscious gesture she had developed in the 2 weeks since Julian had presented it at a restaurant where the menus had no prices. She had posted the proposal on 3 different platforms before they had left the table. Neither of them spoke Elena's name directly. That was the etiquette of it. You could define a person entirely by their absence as long as you were careful not to give the absence a face. She was the situation. She was the previous arrangement. She was the before in a story that was now, emphatically and publicly, after. What they did not know, what no one on that sun-warmed terrace with their cold champagne and their gold-foil invitations knew, was that 3 days earlier, in a quiet office on the 14th floor of a building that Celeste had walked past 100 times without knowing who owned it, a set of documents had been filed that would rearrange the entire architecture of the morning they were currently celebrating. The estate they were standing on. The ground beneath the decorators' rented chairs. The view Julian had spent 2 weeks calling his own. All of it had a name on a deed. And it was not his. The champagne was excellent. The flowers were perfect. The terrace glowed in the late morning light like something that would last forever. It would not last the week. She did not sleep. Not because she couldn't, though sleep had become a complicated negotiation in the final weeks of pregnancy, but because there was no time for it and she found, surprisingly, that she didn't want it. There was something clarifying about the hours between midnight and dawn, something that stripped the world down to its essentials, numbers, names, signatures, and the soft blue light of a laptop screen in a hotel room that Marcus had booked under a name that wasn't hers. She worked from a chair with a pillow at her back and a legal pad on the table beside her, and Marcus sat across from her with his sleeves rolled to the elbows, a phone at each ear at certain points, speaking in the low precise language of men who move money the way other men move furniture, carefully, without announcing it, making sure nothing breaks in transit. The first account was frozen by 2 a.m. It was a subsidiary, one of the operational accounts Julian used to service the mansion's running costs. Staff payroll, maintenance contracts, the quarterly fee for the security system he had installed after convincing Elena it was for her protection. She watched Marcus's associate confirm the freeze with a single line of text on a secure terminal and felt nothing dramatic. No surge of satisfaction. Just the quiet, functional click of a thing falling into place. "He'll notice that one by morning," Marcus said. "Good," Elena said, and turned the page on her legal pad. The debts had been easier to locate than she expected, which said something about Julian that she filed away without comment. He had borrowed against almost everything, the East Wing renovation, the car collection, the vineyard property in the valley that he had described to friends as an investment, but had never once produced a bottle of wine. Each debt was held by a different lender, structured to look diversified, but the architecture underneath was the same. He had built his empire the way certain men build reputations, on the assumption that no one would ever look too closely, and that by the time they did, it would be too late to matter. Elena bought the first debt package at 3:17 a.m. The second at 4:40. By the time the city outside her window had begun its gray, reluctant transition toward morning, she held a controlling interest in 5 of the 7 outstanding obligations attached to Julian's assets. The mansion. The offshore account he believed was untraceable. The corporate line of credit that his entire current venture depended on like a man depends on a rope he has forgotten he is holding. She set down her pen and pressed both hands to her stomach, feeling the baby's slow, sleeping weight. "Are you all right?" Marcus asked. He had learned over the past 48 hours to ask this not with alarm but with the steady practicality of someone checking an instrument reading. "Yes," she said. And then, because it was true and because the truth had become important to her in a way it hadn't been when she was trying to hold her marriage together. My father would have done this differently. He would have been more patient. Your father was patient for 30 years, Marcus said. I think he'd consider the timeline appropriate. She looked at the legal pad. The columns of numbers, the entity names, the neat notations that represented the quiet dismantling of a world Julian had built on borrowed money and borrowed time. He was asleep right now, almost certainly. In her house. In the bed she had chosen. With Celeste's cream blazer folded over the chair in the corner and a glass of expensive champagne probably still half finished on the nightstand because that was the kind of man he was, someone who celebrated before the work was done. He did not know that she had spent the night becoming his largest creditor. He did not know that the roof over his head had changed hands while he slept. He did not know that the woman he had called a janitor's daughter, the woman he had given 48 hours to pack a single carry-on and disappear, had spent those same 48 hours buying the ground out from under him. She closed the laptop. What's next? She said. She arrived at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, which was deliberate. Julian was a man who conducted his cruelties in the evening, when the light was low and the witnesses were few. Elena preferred the full honest glare of a Tuesday morning, when the world was awake and paying attention. There were 4 black SUVs. They pulled up the circular driveway in a clean, unhurried line and stopped with the quiet precision of vehicles that understood their purpose. Marcus rode in the first one with her. Behind them came 2 associates from the firm, a property management team, and a woman named Diane who specialized in corporate asset recovery and had a handshake like a verdict. Elena was wearing navy. She had bought new shoes. Julian answered the door himself, which told her the housekeeper had already been informed. He was in a dress shirt, open at the collar, and his expression moved through several phases in the space of 2 seconds, surprise, then irritation, then the particular manufactured calm of a man who has decided to perform confidence he does not feel. Elena. He looked past her at the SUVs, at Marcus, at Diane with her briefcase. What is this? Good morning, Julian, she said. She didn't wait for him to step aside. She walked in. The foyer looked the same, marble floors, double staircase, the chandelier catching the morning light the way it always had. Celeste appeared at the top of the stairs in a silk robe, her hand on the banister, looking down with an expression that hadn't yet decided what it wanted to be. Elena stopped in the center of the room and turned to face her husband. I need you to listen carefully, she said, because I'm going to say this once. Marcus stepped forward and placed a document on the hall table. It was thick, tabbed, and bore the letterhead of Thorne and Associates alongside the registered seal of a holding company called Hayes Meridian Group, a name that meant nothing to Julian and everything to everyone else in the room. This house, Elena said, was purchased in 2003 by a shell company called Aldrin Property Holdings. You signed a lease agreement that year. You may remember it as a mortgage, because that is how it was presented to you, but the underlying title was never transferred. You have been a tenant, Julian. For 11 years, you have been a tenant of my father's company. The chandelier light fell across his face and she watched the color leave it. That's not, he started. The deed is on page 4, Marcus said pleasantly. The original lease is on page 9. Your signature appears on both. Celeste had come halfway down the stairs. She had stopped. Hayes Meridian also holds the majority stake in Vantage Capital Partners, Elena continued, which, as of this morning, is the primary shareholder of Callaway Group. She let that land. Watched Julian's jaw tighten as the shape of it became clear. Your company, Julian. Your deals, your contacts, your legacy. She said the last word the way he had said janitor's daughter, plainly, without malice, which made it worse. Effective today, your consultancy contract with Callaway is terminated. The terms are in the document. You can't. It's already done. The room held its breath. Somewhere in the back of the house a clock ticked. The property management team had begun a quiet, efficient movement through the ground floor, cataloging, documenting, the way professionals do when they have done something many times and feel no need to dramatize it. Elena looked up at Celeste on the stairs. Celeste, who had smirked at her belly. Who had whispered about time when her father's casket was lowered into the ground. She held the look for a moment, then let it go, because Celeste was not worth the full weight of her attention. She picked up her father's envelope from her bag, empty now, its contents long since actioned and filed and turned into the machinery of consequence, and set it gently on the hall table beside the document. She walked toward the door. "You have 48 hours, she said, without turning around. "That's more than fair." She stepped into the Tuesday morning light and did not look back. 6 months is not a long time. And yet. Elena stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of the 43rd floor, her son against her chest in the soft wrap her housekeeper had shown her how to tie, and looked out at the city the way her father must have looked at it for decades, quietly, without announcing herself, knowing what she knew. The vantage tower was visible from here, its glass face catching the late afternoon light and throwing it back in long gold sheets across the skyline. Her father had built that. She had signed 3 more like it in the last 90 days alone. The office was hers now. Not inherited in the way people assumed when they heard the story, not handed over like a gift wrapped in grief, but earned in the specific way that exhausted people earn things, through weeks of 18-hour days and boardrooms that went quiet when she walked in and then gradually, reluctantly, stopped going quiet. Through learning the language of a world her father had mastered and deliberately kept from her until she was ready to speak it herself. Arthur, the baby, her Arthur, stirred against her chest and made the small sound he made when he was deciding between sleep and wakefulness. She pressed her lips to the top of his head, that particular warmth, and felt the thing she always felt in those moments that she did not yet have words for. Something between fullness and ache. Something that lived right at the border of joy and loss, where her father's absence pressed up against her son's presence and the two things existed together without resolving. She had named him on the second day, when the nurse had asked, and she had known without hesitation. Arthur. The nurse had smiled and written it down, and Elena had looked at her son's face, new and unformed and already, somehow, familiar, and made him a silent promise that she intended to keep for the rest of her life. She was still standing at the window when her assistant knocked and entered with a tablet, setting it on the desk with the careful efficiency that Elena had come to rely on. "You said to flag anything from the Meridian coverage," she said. "There's a segment." Elena crossed to the desk and looked at the screen. The news report was brief. A business segment, the kind that runs in the last quarter of a broadcast when the anchors have loosened slightly. The Chiron read, "Local firms see executive reshuffling amid market corrections." And there, in B-roll footage shot outside a glass office building in the financial district, was Julian. He was holding a lanyard with a clip-on badge. He was wearing a suit she recognized, the charcoal one, slightly too wide in the shoulders now, as if he had lost weight in the wrong direction. He was walking through a revolving door with his head slightly down and his phone in his hand, not being interviewed, not being named, just visible in the background of a story about someone else entirely. An extra in the frame of his own diminishment. She watched the clip for its full 12 seconds. She felt no triumph. She had expected to, had braced herself against it, had prepared a private speech about grace and restraint she would have given herself in the mirror if the satisfaction had arrived. But what she felt instead was something quieter and more complete than satisfaction. It was the feeling of a door closing evenly in its frame, the soft mechanical click of a thing that had finally been set right. She handed the tablet back. "Anything else before 4 o'clock? The Eastfield Phase 2 call. And the Hayes Foundation Board wants to confirm the scholarship recipients for the spring cycle." "Confirm them," Elena said. "All of them." She turned back to the window. Arthur shifted in his wrap, found whatever he was looking for, and settled. Outside, the vantage tower held the last of the afternoon light as the city moved beneath it, unhurried, enormous, indifferent to who built what and who knew whose name. Her father had understood that. Had lived inside that understanding for 40 years. She was just beginning to learn it. But she had time. She had her son. She had his name. It was, as Arthur Hayes had always believed, enough. And that is where Elena's story rests, not in revenge, not in bitterness, but in a son sleeping against her chest and a name carried forward into the world with love. If this story stayed with you, if it made you feel something real, please subscribe. Leave a comment telling us which moment hit you hardest. Share this with someone who is quietly carrying more than the world gives them credit for. Every time you subscribe, you're telling us to keep finding these stories, and we will keep finding them, as long as you're here to receive them. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next one.